Glenara Bates, just 3 years old, with brown eyes that seemed to hold the whole sky and a smile bright enough to light up an entire room. In the loving arms of her second family, Peg and Fontaine, she grew strong, safe, and blissfully unaware of how harsh the world could be. But then, with a single court ruling won that placed family reunification above every other concern, she was taken from the only safe home she had ever known and returned to a place where darkness was already waiting. 18 months later, that same angel was reduced to a fragile frame, weighing less than 13 pounds, her tiny body bearing more than 100 marks of harm. From a vibrant, joyful child, she had been diminished beyond recognition. How could this happen? Who stood by and let it unfold? And how did the very system meant to shield her become the channel through which she met her fate? This is not just a story, it is a call to remember Glenara Bates and to act whenever you see signs of a child in danger. Share her story, speak out, and demand change so that no other child slips through the cracks. Let's ensure her voice, taken far too soon, is heard loud and clear. Let's rewind time, back to the very first moments of Glenara Bates' life. A tiny girl who carried within her a deeply moving miracle of survival. Glenara was born on January 18, 2013 in Cincinnati, Ohio, a vibrant city, yet one with hidden corners of poverty. She arrived prematurely at 34 weeks, weighing only 1.9 kilos, about 4 pounds 3 ounces, her fragile body like a small, flickering candle in the wind. For Glenara, the world at that moment was likely a blur of sensations, the hum of hospital machines, cold lights, and the absence of a mother's embrace, the warmth that a typical child would feel as the first touch of love. Her birth was a miracle, as her mother, Andrea Bradley, had not sought prenatal care, and at the time of delivery, tested positive for harmful substances that caused Glenara to suffer from intrauterine growth restriction. Glenara's reflexes were weak, each breath a battle to survive. While a typical child would be cradled and sung to by their mother, Glenara experienced only the coldness and uncertainty of her earliest days. Andrea Bradley, Glenara's biological mother, was a distant figure in the infant's tender world. At 25 years old when Glenara was born, Andrea carried a past heavy with trauma. A mother since the age of 15, she had given birth to 8 children with 4 different men, 2 of whom were incarcerated at the time, and another who would later be imprisoned, struggling with severe depression and bipolar disorder. Coupled with an IQ of 67 below average, Andrea was trapped in a storm of inner turmoil, unable to care for herself, let alone a fragile child like Glenara. Unlike mothers who cradle their children, kissing their foreheads with overflowing love, Andrea was held back by substance dependency and mental illness. In 2007, another of her children was born with traces of those substances in their system, drawing the attention of Child Protective Services CPS. By 2009, she was convicted of child mistreatment after one of her children suffered serious injuries, their body covered in multiple bruises. Yet, instead of revoking her parental rights, the system only required her to undergo short-term mental health treatment before returning her children to her. Andrea's interactions with Glenara were almost non-existent. She rarely visited her, offered no hugs, sang no lullabies, leaving an emotional void in the heart of her baby. To Glenara, her mother was likely just a faint shadow, offering neither the warmth nor the safety she so desperately craved. Glenn Bates, Glenara's biological father, was not the support she needed either, with a history of aggressive behavior and a volatile temper. Glenn lived in a filthy house, its walls stained with waste and blood-like marks, a place that could hardly be called a home, while a typical father might hold his child, play gently, or support the mother through challenges. Glenn was consumed by a chaotic lifestyle and the fits of rage He seemed to attempt playing the role of a cheerful father when with Glenara. But those moments were rare and lacked sincerity. He did nothing to help Andrea overcome her substance dependency or mental illness. Nor did he provide stability for the family. To Glenara, her father was likely just a distant figure, not close enough for her to feel love or protection. Glenn's actions, though not yet overtly cruel, revealed an emotionally absent father, leaving her in a world without protection from either parent. But fate brought Glenara a radiant ray of hope when CPS intervened shortly after her birth, placing her in the foster home of Peg and Fontaine, a kind-hearted couple already caring for 4 of her biological siblings. For Glenara, the foster home was a completely different world, a place where she experienced genuine love. In 8 months, from a frail baby weighing just 1.9 kilos, she rapidly gained weight to about 9 kg and 20 pounds. She crawled, took her first wobbly steps, and flashed radiant smiles to Peg and Fontaine. Glenara was a ray of sunshine, a chubby, happy baby with curious, sparkling eyes. Peg held her gently, singing lullabies each night. Fontaine played with her and her siblings, filling the house with laughter. They cared for her diligently, from feeding her on schedule to monitoring every developmental milestone. For Glenara, Peg's embraces were the first warmth she ever knew, and Fontaine's games were the first joy she ever felt. Unlike the coldness from her biological parents, Peg and Fontaine gave her a vibrant world where she was loved like a true daughter. From Glenara's innocent perspective, this was paradise every day, filled with laughter, gentle touches, and the sense of safety she had never known from Andrea or Glenn. Peg and Fontaine didn't just care for Glenara, they loved her deeply. They worried about her biological family's circumstances, frequently communicating with CPS and even inquiring about formal adoption. Their actions stemmed from unconditional love, sleepless nights, soothing her to sleep, hours of playtime to make her smile, and unwavering dedication to ensuring her health. But while Peg and Fontaine poured their hearts into Glenara, Andrea and Glenn remained lost in their own darkness. Andrea, despite fleeting moments of wanting to be a mother, couldn't overcome her mental illness or addiction. Her visits to Glenara at the foster home were few, often brief, and lacked connection. She seemed to view reclaiming her children as a way to assert herself, rather than a genuine desire to care for them. Glenn, instead of supporting Andrea or building a stable home, continued living in his squalid house, letting his anger dictate his behavior. Their actions, or rather, their lack of action, made the family stability that should have been Glenara's foundation an unfillable void. Then came the most pivotal moment, marking a turning point that completely altered Glenara's life. In September 2013, the Hamilton County, Ohio, court decided to return Glenara and her 4 siblings to their biological mother, Andrea Bradley. CPS, tasked with protecting children, believed Andrea had made progress based on superficial changes, such as attending a few mental health treatment sessions. But CPS's actions lacked thorough evaluation. They overlooked Andrea's history of substance use, mental illness, and previous abuse, as well as Glenn's violent lifestyle. Peg and Fontaine, who had given Glenara their wholehearted love, desperately warned of the potential dangers, but their voices went unheard. For Glenara, this turning point was a shift from light to darkness. From her perspective, the world once filled with Peg and Fontaine's laughter and warm embraces became unfamiliar. The moments of play with her siblings dwindled, and the safety that once enveloped her was replaced by the coldness of Andrea and Glenn. CPS monitored the situation for 3 months before closing the case, leaving Glenara in an environment where no one truly protected her. Peg and Fontaine, though heartbroken, could only promise to keep visiting, but they had no power to stop the court's decision. If Peg and Fontaine's voices had been heeded, If CPS had more thoroughly examined Andrea and Glenn's past, would Glenara's life have turned out differently? That question haunts when reflecting on her early days, a miraculous survival, a brief period of happiness, and then a turning point that thrust her into uncertainty, before her life changed completely. Glenara was a chubby, joyful baby, loved by those not bound to her by blood, yet abandoned by her biological parents and the system meant to protect her. Now, the story shifts to a darker phase, where the signs of horror begin to reveal themselves. When Glenara returned home in 2014, her world still seemed to hold a flicker of light. At 2 years old, she carried faint memories from the foster home where there was laughter, warm hugs, and a sense of safety while playing with her siblings. To her, her mother, Andrea, was perhaps a gentle figure, someone who once stroked her hair and whispered, "Be good," when she cried. Her father, Glenn, though stern, sometimes picked her up, making her think he was a strong protector. But then, like an unexpected cold wind, everything began to change. Her mother hugged her less, her eyes growing distant, replaced by sharp commands of be quiet when Glenara cried from hunger. Her father started yelling, his heavy footsteps making her flinch and cower. From Glenara's perspective, the once warm world turned cold, as if love had silently abandoned her. By the summer of that year, a storm arrived without warning. Glenara was locked in a cramped, filthy bathroom, where the stench of feces and reddish stains on the walls clung to her every breath. For a 2-year-old, it was a terrifying prison. 4 cold walls, no laughter, no siblings, only darkness and loneliness. She lightly scratched at the walls until her hands were injured, crying out in desperation, hoping someone would hear. But all she got in return were shouts of stop crying or a terrifying silence. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, forcing her to lick crumbs off the floor. But each time, her mother looked at her with disgust, saying, "Filthy thing," to Glenara. Those words were like cuts to her heart, making her feel unworthy of love, leaving her to curl up, hugging her trembling little legs on the cold winter floor. From Andrea's perspective, the mother, things were more complicated. She loved her child, but her heart was a tangled mess of severe depression and bipolar disorder. She feared Glenn Bates, the man who controlled everything in the house. Every time she wanted to hug Glenara or feed her, she heard his shouts, "Don't spoil her." She was afraid that defying him would make him erupt, or worse, that Child Protective Services would take her daughter away. So she chose silence, occasionally sneaking Glenara small bits of food, not daring to hug or comfort her. In Andrea's heart, there was likely a mix of guilt and paralysis. She told herself that keeping her daughter with her was enough, but that very silence pushed Glenara into a life of constant suffering. To Glenara, Glenn Bates was a terrifying shadow. The sound of his footsteps made her tremble, her wide, fearful eyes seeing him as a predatory beast. He called his physical assaults games like doggy going to get you, when he bit her arms and legs hard, leaving deep, open wounds. She screamed in pain, but he only laughed, saying, just playing, to her. It wasn't a game, but searing pain, a fear that gripped her every time he came near. She learned to curl up, trying to stay silent, hoping he'd overlook her. In Bates's mind, those actions were his way of venting anger, raised in violence. He saw harming as discipline, a way to assert control in the home. He hated Glenara perhaps because she was weak, or because he saw her as a burden. Each time he threw her against the wall, bit her, or yelled "filthy eater," he told himself it was to make her better. But deep down, he knew he was masking his cruelty with excuses, devoid of love or empathy for the fragile child. Glenara's pain grew heavier by the day. Hunger caused her hair to fall out, her leg muscles withered, leaving her unable to walk. only able to stand with support. She was doused with very hot water, the burns on her skin making her scream. But her parents only said, "To make you clean." Each new lash overlapped old scars. 3 of her teeth knocked out, causing agony every time she tried to swallow the meager food she got. Weighing only 5.9 kilo, her body was like a dry leaf, ready to crumble. In her world, everything was reduced to pain and loneliness. She likely looked at her mother with pleading eyes, only to receive a cold stare or silence. To her, adults were no longer a safe haven, but the source of her fear. In rare moments when Andrea looked at her daughter, her heart probably ached, but she was trapped between her fear of Bates, her fear of losing her child, and the darkness of her mental illness. She convinced herself things would be fine, that as long as no one found out, the family would be safe. Meanwhile, Bates grew more brutal, as if hurting Glenara was the only way he could feel in control of his chaotic life. Hope for Glenara flickered and faded. In December 2014, Peg and Fontaine, who once brought her joy in the foster home, came to deliver Christmas gifts, but they were denied entry, only catching a glimpse of a girl with lifeless eyes. If Glenara knew they were there, she might have hoped for a hug, to hear loving words again. But the door slammed shut, and she was locked back in darkness, feeling the world had forgotten her. That same month, her parents took her to the hospital for malnutrition when she weighed just 7.8 kilo. In the hospital, the gentle touches of nurses were a rare warmth. But then, she was sent back home, where the nightmare continued. By March 2015, a social worker visited but reported that she was healthy and happy. To Glenara, that was a betrayal. She was in pain, starving, but no one saw. Neighbors and the foster family reported concerns 5 times, but Child Protective Services did nothing, leaving her to live in daily fear. On the afternoon of March 28, 2015, Glenara's world collapsed entirely. According to her 10-year-old sister, Glenn Bates grabbed her by the legs and slammed her head against the wall. To Glenara, it was excruciating pain. Her head felt like it was splitting, her world fading in her weak cries before falling silent. Instead of taking her to the hospital, Andrea took a needle and thread meant for clothes to stitch the wound on her head. For Glenara, each stitch was a new stab of pain, turning her mother into a collaborator in her suffering. Andrea did it out of fear of Bates and fear of being discovered, but in her heart, there was likely unspoken torment. Meanwhile, Bates continued to bite, shake, strike, and starve her, as if she were just an object for his rage. Glenara's body was now a fragile shell traumatic brain injury. Severe malnutrition, no urine in her bladder, her intestines filled with gas from hunger. She no longer cried, no longer ate, just lay there, waiting for the darkness to swallow her. In her world, all that remained was absolute pain and loneliness, where the adults around her had made her a victim of their cruelty and indifference. On the morning of March 29, 2015, Andrea Bradley carried the unresponsive body of Glenara Bates into Cincinnati Children's Hospital. In a panic, saying only that she suddenly passed out. The scene that followed left the entire emergency room in stunned silence. Dr. Charles Strait, the first to examine her, was shocked by the tiny body weighing only 5.9 kilo gaunt like a newborn. Not a 2.5-year-old girl. Over 100 wounds covered her body, crisscrossing lash marks. Deep bite marks matching adult teeth. Blistered burns. 3 teeth missing from trauma. Patchy hair loss. Muscles so atrophied she couldn't stand on her own. Worse still, an autopsy revealed brain hemorrhages from severe head trauma, intestines filled with gas from prolonged starvation, and an empty bladder with no urine. I've never seen anything so shocking, Strait later testified in court, his voice trembling, eyes burning with outrage. All the doctors and nurses, Despite witnessing countless severe cases in their careers, couldn't bear to look directly at Glenara's body, they turned away, covered their mouths, trying to hold back tears before a child's form so severely harmed it barely resembled a child. The autopsy results from forensic pathologist Jennifer Scott determined the cause of death-battered child syndrome, brain hemorrhages from violent rotational force, and severe malnutrition. Coroner Lakshmi Samarko, with a steely voice, declared, "This is the worst case I've ever seen." Glenara was subjected to cruelty for nearly her entire short life. These devastating details not only shocked, but ignited collective rage, leaving people to wonder how could a child be thrust into such a living hell. Immediately, the police launched an investigation, arresting Andrea Bradley and Glenn Bates on March 29, 2015, charging them with aggravated murder and child endangerment. A search of their home uncovered the bathroom where Glenara was confined, a filthy space filled with feces and reddish stains. With scratch marks on the walls and old burn marks on the tub, clear evidence of prolonged mistreatment. The stench was so overpowering that investigators had to cover their noses, unable to believe a child had survived in such conditions. During questioning, Bates repeatedly changed his story, at times blaming Bradley, at others admitting to biting her playfully, then claiming he swung her by the legs, causing her shoe to slip and her head to hit the floor about a week earlier. His nonchalant demeanor when viewing photos of the body, showing no emotion or remorse, left detectives Marcus McNeil, Bill Hilbert, and Eric Carigolo in deep shock. Bradley, with an IQ of 67, stated she was controlled by Bates, admitted to being bitten herself, but was deemed ineligible for the death penalty due to her intellectual disability. The investigation concluded that Glenara's injuries resulted from rotational acceleration from violent shaking or throwing, not a fall, combined with prolonged cruel treatment. The trial of Glenn Bates in October 2016 was an emotionally charged journey, unforgettable even for seasoned legal professionals. From the outset, as the prosecution presented evidence, they shocked the courtroom by displaying photos of Glenara at the foster home Chubby, smiling brightly, contrasted with images of her emaciated body just 18 months later. This contrast was not just to illustrate the brutality, but to place the jury in Glenara's position, a child once loved, now thrust into sustained harm by the very parents meant to protect her. The jury and onlookers were stunned, outraged by the failure of the child protection system, with local media reporting relentlessly, turning each trial day into a social event. The prosecution emphasized every physical detail: 5.9 kilograms over 100 wounds, bruises at various stages to paint a picture of prolonged abuse, while the defense tried to shift blame to illness or poverty circumstances, leading to heated debates. The courtroom atmosphere grew heavy as witnesses like Pegg and Fontaine, who had cared for Glenara, broke down in tears recounting her joyful days. They blamed themselves for not protecting her from the decision to return her to her biological parents, leaving everyone in the room, from the jury to the packed public seats, many wearing shirts or holding signs with child protection messages, feeling the torment of those who had been substitute mothers for Glenara. As the trial moved into the debate and rebuttal phase, tension escalated. The prosecution hammered Bates with pointed questions about physically harming, starving, and mistreating his daughter, aiming to expose his inhumanity, a father who turned games into tools of torment, causing Glenara to live in constant fear. Bates kept changing his story, at times denying responsibility, at others blaming Bradley, revealing the image of a violent and irresponsible father, stirring public outrage with whispers, some leaving the courtroom unable to bear the details of the cruelty. Fiery exchanges between prosecution and defense forced the judge to intervene to maintain order, while forensic pathologist Jennifer Scott provided evidence of bruises at various stages, confirming battered child syndrome. The testimony of Glenara's 10-year-old sister was like a knife, I saw Dad grab her by the legs and slam her head against the wall. She cried and then went silent, leaving the courtroom deathly quiet, with only soft sobs audible, placing listeners in the position of a child witnessing her sister's torment, fear, and helplessness permeating the air. Coroner Sammarco reinforced subjected to cruelty her entire life. Injuries from rotational acceleration, solidifying the prosecution's case that Bates was primarily responsible for starving and mistreating his daughter. Not fully attributable to Bradley, the mother the prosecution described as a passive accomplice, trapped between fear of Bates and mental illness, but still choosing silence over protecting her child. The defense tried to deflect by shifting blame to Bradley, emphasizing her mental illness and greater time spent at home, while Bates only stayed there 1 to 2 weeks, mostly living at his mother's, and his biting was just play. Their intent was to humanize Bates, placing listeners in the position of a father raised in violence, now repeating the cycle. But this only fueled public outrage, with murmurs spreading as Bates casually viewed photos of the body, calling his violence play, describing Glenara as cold, lips purple without emotion. Bradley, though admitting to being controlled, was complicit when she stitched the wound on Glenara's head instead of taking her to the hospital, showing resignation and irresponsibility, a mother consumed by her inner darkness, but not enough to justify abandoning her child. Bradley did not face a full trial. She took a plea deal, receiving 15 years to life, and even gave birth to her 8th child in prison, when the court declared Glenn Bates guilty of aggravated murder. Many in the courtroom burst into tears or covered their faces, reflecting collective relief. Some of Glenara's family members felt both relief that justice was served and torment, knowing the verdict couldn't bring her back, placing us in the position of relatives forever mourning an innocent soul. Judge Robert Ruhlman, in a rare moment of emotion, emphasized, "This is one of the most brutal cases I've ever seen." In October 2016, Bates was convicted of aggravated murder, receiving the death penalty, along with other charges like endangering children 8 years and murder 15 years to life. However, in 2020, the Ohio Supreme Court overturned the death penalty due to evidence of racial bias in the jury. By 2023, Bates pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter, receiving a 25-year sentence, with 8 years credited for time served. As of 2025, no further changes have occurred, an outcome that left many disappointed. Feeling justice for Glenara was not fully served. The story of Glenara Bates is not just a criminal case, it is a heart and tears indictment of both individuals and the system. A 2-year-old child with eyes that once sparkled with joy was reduced to a skin and bones body weighing a mere 5.9 kilos, bearing over 100 wounds, lash marks, bite marks, burns. Each scar not only accused Glenn Bates, the father who turned games into tools of torment, but also exposed the silent complicity of Andrea Bradley, the mother who chose fear and resignation over protecting her child. The trial concluded with verdicts: Bates sentenced to 25 years in prison, Bradley to 15 years to life, but the question of justice remains unresolved. Can those years of imprisonment compensate for a childhood stolen? Or is it all just a cold, belated response after a life has already been taken? This case ignited a fierce wave of outrage in Cincinnati and beyond. Prosecutor Joe Dieters, his voice choked with indignation, stated bluntly, "This child slipped through the cracks of the system." His words were a dagger twisting into the reputation of the Child Protective Services CPS, an agency meant to be the final shield, but which ignored at least 5 reports of mistreatment, even documenting that Glenara was healthy and happy just 3 weeks before her passing. The consequences were inevitable. 2 caseworkers resigned, 2 managers were suspended, and Director Moira Weir bowed her head, admitting a failure to follow protocol. But those apologies could not soothe the community. Glenara's grandmother, Dana Bradley, sued CPS for sending her granddaughter back into danger. The lawsuit was allowed to proceed by the Ohio Supreme Court in 2021 and remains unresolved to this day, a gaping wound, perpetually raw with outrage and grief. The community demanded sweeping reforms, an end to returning children to families proven unsafe, an end to subsidies for caregivers who harm children. They echoed Albert Einstein's words: "The world is not destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who watch and do nothing." This quote became a mirror reflecting the very silent complicity that ended Glenara's life. Amid the darkness, there were glimmers of light. Glenara's siblings were placed in new foster homes. Her 10-year-old sister, the key witness, spoke, as if finding a release. Now she doesn't have to suffer anymore. Peg and Fontaine, who had cradled Glenara during her rare moments of happiness, established a small memorial in Cincinnati. It featured a photo of the happy Buddha baby Glenara, chubby, with curious eyes and a full smile. Peg, her voice trembling, shared, "We still dream of her smile. Glenara deserved to live." But that love could not overcome indifference. The Glenara case exposed fatal flaws in the child protection system, where a single, overlooked sign of abuse or ignored report can be a one-way ticket to a child's death. It is a warning that silence, even once, can be enough to cost a fragile life. Remember, Glenara was only 2 years old, just 2. If you suspect a child is being harmed, don't wait. Don't hesitate, report it immediately. Demand CPS reform. Hold them accountable so no more cracks remain. If this story breaks your heart, share it. Perhaps your voice will save a child somewhere. This is not just a case. It is a cry for help from Glenara's very heart, and a question for all of us when you hear that cry. What will you do?